They called her too big to be loved, a burden. Her own father sold her for a sack of grain and $40. She was 16 years old then. She's 50 now. And Clara still remembered the crunch of the wagon wheels pulling away, leaving her standing in the snow. She remembered how the cold bit into her skin, but the shame bit deeper. Most folks in the valley figured a mountain man would treat her like property. Another mouth to feed, another pair of hands to work. But Eli Harper, the man who paid the $40, he didn't put her in chains. He didn't raise his voice. He gave her something she'd never known in her entire life. Space, quiet dignity. But what nobody in the Bitterbrush Valley knew, what even Eli was about to find out, was that behind the quiet sadness in Clara's eyes, there was a storm. A storm that had been gathering for 34 years. She'd been passed from one cruel home to another, worked to the bone, told she was too much and not enough in the very same breath. And the silent man she now lived with, the one they all whispered had bought her, was about to see a side of her that would change everything. A side of her that the mountain itself would learn to fear. It all started the night the blizzard rolled down from the high ridge, a wall of white that swallowed the fences and turned the world dark. Eli went out to check on the livestock, a simple task he'd done 1,000 times. But this time, he didn't come back. When Clara found him, he was lying half buried in the snow, a dark gash on his temple, his breath coming in shallow, ragged clouds. And he wasn't alone. She could see tracks in the snow, heavy boot prints from more than one man. They hadn't just been passing through. They had been waiting. They were still out there, somewhere in the swirling white. In that moment, Clara had a choice. Run, hide, disappear into the storm and save herself. Or stand her ground and fight for the one person in this world who had never, not once, thrown her away. What happened next became a legend in the valley. The night the fat girl her father sold became the woman the mountain could not break. But this isn't just a story about survival. It's a story about secrets. Because Eli Harper wasn't just a simple mountain man. And those men in the storm? They weren't random strangers. They were ghosts from a past he thought he'd buried long ago. And they hadn't come for his livestock. They had come for him. Before you think you know how this story ends, you should know this. The mountain man didn't just save her. She was about to save him in ways he never imagined. And the life they would build together wouldn't be built on quiet kindness. It would be forged in fire, blood, and a truth so dark it threatened to swallow them both whole. They called her too big to be wanted. At 16, Clara weighed more than the neighbor's work mule, or so the cruel jokes went in her small Wyoming town. Her father, a man with eyes like frozen puddles and debts stacked higher than his woodpile, saw her as his last bargaining chip. It was the winter of 1882, and the world was buried in white. Her father stood on the porch with a stranger, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a worn coat. A mountain man, the whispers said, lived alone in the high pass where the wind never stopped screaming. Clara was inside, watching through the warped glass of the window. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw the glint of coins. She saw her father nod. That night she was told to pack. Her things didn't fill a flour sack. A patched dress, a comb with missing teeth, and her mother's old Bible. The next morning the stranger was waiting by a mule-drawn sled. Eli Harper. He didn't look at her like the town boys did. There was no smirk, no pity, just a quiet, measuring stillness that was somehow more unnerving. Her father didn't say goodbye. He just turned and went back inside, the sound of the coins still echoing in her memory. Clara climbed into the sled. The mountain man handed her a thick wool blanket. He didn't speak. He just guided the mule north, away from the only life she'd ever known, toward the jagged peaks that tore at the sky. The journey was silent. The cold was a physical thing, a weight on her chest. Clara sat stiff, clutching the blanket, waiting for the cruelty she knew was coming. It always came, but it didn't. When they reached his cabin, a small, solid shape huddled against a wall of pines, Eli just opened the door, stepped aside, and said, "It's warm in here." No command, no shove, just an invitation. She stepped inside. The cabin was one room, clean and spare. A stove in the center, shelves stacked with jars, a neatly made bed against the far wall. It smelled of pine and wood smoke. It smelled safe, but Clara knew better. Safety was an illusion, a trap. She waited for the other shoe to drop. He set a small bundle on the table, biscuits and dried meat. "You can take the bed," he said, his back to her. "I'll use the cot by the stove." Clara froze. She waited for the condition, the price. There was none. He poured 2 tins of coffee and sat at the table. He ate without looking at her, but he'd placed a plate for her across from him. She didn't move. She didn't trust it. This wasn't how the world worked. Kindness always had a cost, and she'd learned long ago she couldn't afford it. He finished his meal, stood up, and took his coat from a peg by the door. "There's wood for the fire, water in the bucket." He paused, his hand on the latch. "No one will bother you here." And then he was gone, leaving her alone in the quiet cabin. Clara stood there for a long time, listening to the sound of the wind. She looked at the plate of food he'd left her. She looked at the warm bed. This was a test. It had to be. He was waiting to see what she would do. If she would steal from him, if she would run, she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. She ignored the food. She ignored the bed. She pulled her thin shawl tighter, sat in the hard-backed chair by the cold stove, and prepared to wait. She would not be broken. She would not be tricked. She'd survived this long by trusting no one, and she wasn't about to start now. The silence in the cabin was deafening, but the war inside her head was even louder. The first day turned into the first week. They lived in a world of silence. Eli would leave before dawn and return after dusk, always leaving a plate of food on the table for her. She never touched it. She survived on the stale bread she'd hidden in her pocket from her father's house, and by melting snow for water when he was gone. She grew weaker, the hunger a constant, gnawing ache in her belly. She watched him from the corner of her eye. He was methodical. He chopped wood, checked his trap lines, repaired the roof. He never spoke to her, and he never acknowledged the untouched food. It was a battle of wills, a silent war in a one-room cabin. She was determined to win. She had to show him she was not some stray dog he could tame with scraps. One afternoon, a week into her hunger strike, she was looking out the window when she saw him at the edge of the clearing. He wasn't working. He was just standing there looking back at the cabin. And his face, it wasn't angry. It wasn't impatient. It looked sad. The expression unnerved her more than any threat could have. It was a crack in his armor. That night he came in as usual, but instead of just leaving the food, he sat down across from her. The untouched plates from the past week were still on the table, a testament to her defiance. He didn't look at them. He just looked at her. "You're going to starve," he said. His voice wasn't an accusation. It was a simple statement of fact. "Better to starve on my feet than live on my knees," she whispered, her own voice hoarse from disuse. He considered that for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "All right." He stood up, gathered all the plates of food, and walked to the door. He opened it and threw the food out into the snow. For a wild moment, she thought he was finally giving up, casting her out. But he came back inside, shut the door, and went to the shelves. He took down a sack of flour, a tin of lard, a canister of sugar. He placed them all on the table in front of her. Not a prepared meal, the raw ingredients. "This is your half," he said quietly. "It's not a gift. It's not charity. It's your share. What you do with it is your own business." He turned and went to his cot by the stove, pulling a blanket over himself without another word. Clara stared at the flour, the sugar, the lard. This changed everything. It wasn't a handout. It was a division of property, a partnership. It was respect. Her stomach cramped with hunger, her head swam with dizziness. But for the first time in a week, she stood up. Her legs trembled, but she made her way to the table. With shaking hands, she opened the flour sack. The smell was dusty and sweet and full of life. She wasn't accepting his charity. She was claiming what was hers. But as she scooped the flour into a bowl, she had a chilling thought. This wasn't just a share of food. This was a share of his life. And if she was part of his life, that meant she was also part of his secrets. And a man who lived this far from the world, a man this quiet and this careful, his secrets had to be dangerous. As winter deepened, a strange rhythm took hold. Clara cooked her food. Eli cooked his. They ate at the same table, a silent truce between them. She began to mend his torn shirts, leaving them folded on his cot without a word. He began leaving a small stack of freshly split kindling by the stove every morning, a silent acknowledgement. They moved around each other like two solitary planets held in a delicate orbit. She was still wary, still watching, but the sharp edges of her fear were beginning to soften. She was getting stronger. The mountain air and the steady food were filling out her frame, not with the softness of before, but with hard, capable muscle. She learned the sounds of the mountain, the screech of a hawk, the heavy tread of a moose, the whisper of snow falling from a pine bough. One day while Eli was out, she decided to explore. She'd never ventured far from the cabin, afraid of getting lost, afraid of what she might find. But curiosity gnawed at her. Behind the cabin was a small, sturdy shed. The door wasn't locked. She hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open. Inside it was dark and smelled of sawdust and old iron. Tools hung neatly on the walls. Traps were stacked in a corner. But in the back, under a dusty canvas tarp, was something else. A large, heavy wooden chest. It was old, bound with iron straps, and it had a heavy, ornate lock. It was completely out of place in this simple, practical homestead. It looked like a pirate's chest, full of secrets. Her heart began to pound. What was in it? Gold. Weapons. She ran her fingers over the lock. It was cold and solid. This was his past, the secret he was hiding from the world, the reason he lived alone on this mountain. She knew she should leave it. Walk away. It was none of her business. But she couldn't. This chest held the answer to the question that had been haunting her for months. Who was Eli Harper? She looked around the shed, her eyes scanning the cluttered workbench. She found a rusty pry bar. It was heavy in her hands. She could open it. She could know everything. But just as she was about to wedge the bar under the lid, she heard a sound. A twig snapping just outside the shed. Eli was back. Early. She dropped the pry bar with a clatter, her heart leaping into her throat. She quickly threw the canvas back over the chest and scrambled out of the shed, trying to look casual, trying to slow her breathing. Eli was standing by the woodpile, his axe in his hand. He was watching her. Did he see? Did he know what she was about to do? Getting cold, he said, his voice level. But his eyes were different. The quiet sadness was gone, replaced by something hard, something dangerous. Stay inside, he said, and bar the door behind me. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order, and for the first time, Clara felt a true jolt of fear. The threat wasn't in the chest. The threat was outside, and it was coming for them. She ran inside and threw the heavy bar across the door, her hands trembling. She peered through the small window. Eli wasn't chopping wood. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, axe held loosely in one hand, watching the tree line. He looked like a statue, a man carved from the mountain itself. Waiting. Hours passed. The sun began to dip below the peaks, painting the snow in shades of orange and purple. The temperature dropped. Still, he stood there. Clara paced the small cabin, a caged animal. Who was he waiting for? What had she stumbled into? The silence was terrifying. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, sounded like a footstep. Finally, just as darkness settled completely, she heard the heavy crunch of his boots on the porch. The bar on the door rattled. She fumbled with it, her fingers clumsy with cold and fear, and pulled it open. Eli stepped inside, bringing a blast of frigid air with him. He didn't look at her. He went straight to the fireplace and began building up the fire, his movements economical and precise. "Who was out there?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer. He just stared into the flames. "Eli?" He finally looked at her. The hardness was still in his eyes, but there was something else too. Regret. "It's nothing you need to worry about." "Nothing to worry about?" she shot back, her fear turning to anger. "You stood out there for hours with an axe. You told me to bar the door. Don't you dare tell me not to worry." His jaw tightened. He looked from her to the shed outside and back again. The unspoken question hung in the air between them. What did you see in there? He seemed to be measuring her, deciding what to tell her, what to hide. Some things from a man's past, they don't stay buried, he said, his voice low and gravelly. I came up here to get away from them. I thought I had. He looked her straight in the eye. I was wrong. Before she could ask what he meant, he walked over to the wall where his rifle was mounted. He took it down, checked the action, and propped it against the wall next to the door. From now on, he said, we don't open the door after dark. Not for anyone. The finality in his tone sent a shiver down her spine. The war wasn't over. It hadn't even begun. And the silent mountain man she lived with was not a savior. He was a target. And by being here, so was she. The thaw came late that year, the snow clinging to the slopes long into April. The fragile peace inside the cabin was gone, replaced by a tense, unspoken vigilance. Eli never mentioned the watcher in the woods again, but he was different. He cleaned his rifle every night. He never went far from the cabin without it. He taught Clara how to shoot, his hands briefly touching hers as he showed her how to brace the stock against her shoulder. The touch was impersonal, practical, but it sent a jolt through her all the same. He was preparing her. For what, she didn't dare to ask. One afternoon, he announced he had to ride down to Mill Crossing for supplies. Salt, flour, ammunition. It was the first time he'd left the mountains since she arrived. The idea of being left alone terrified her. I'm coming with you, she said. It wasn't a request. He looked at her, about to argue, but then he saw the set of her jaw and just gave a single, curt nod. The ride down was tense. The town was just a handful of buildings huddled by a creek. A general store, a blacksmith, a church with peeling paint. The moment her boots hit the dusty street, Clara felt the eyes on her. Two women on the boardwalk stopped talking and stared. A boy near the hitching post snickered. That's her, he whispered to his friend. The one he bought. Shame, hot and familiar, washed over her. She kept her eyes fixed on the store's door, but she could feel their stares like insects crawling on her skin. Inside, the store smelled of kerosene and coffee beans. Eli nodded to the storekeeper, a balding man named Parnell, who gave Clara a sideways glance that made her feel like a sack of potatoes being weighed. As Eli started gathering supplies, Clara tried to make herself small, wandering over to a barrel of dried beans. She just wanted to be invisible. But then a voice cut through the air, sharp and mocking. Well, look what the mountain coughed up. You're a big one, ain't you? Clara's head snapped up. A woman was standing by the counter, dressed in a green dress that was too fine for this dusty town. She was smirking at Clara. Eli must be needing help with the heavy lifting. The two men by the stove laughed. Clara's face burned. She felt herself shrinking, the shame so powerful it was hard to breathe. But then Eli was there. He moved so fast she barely saw him. He didn't say a word to the woman. He just placed himself between her and Clara, a solid wall. He looked at the storekeeper. Parnell, he said, his voice dangerously low, we'll take 2 sacks of flour, 20 pounds of salt, and all the 44 cartridges you've got. Parnell's eyes widened at the amount of ammunition. That's a lot of cartridges, Eli. Just get them, Eli said, his eyes never leaving the storekeeper's face. He then turned his gaze to the two men by the stove, who suddenly found their boots very interesting. The woman in the green dress, however, didn't back down. Still hiding up on that ridge, Eli? Some things you can't outrun. Eli's hand, which was resting on the counter, clenched into a fist. Martha, he said, the name a warning. Go home. He paid Parnell, his movements stiff with anger. He loaded the supplies onto the mule without a word to Clara. The ride back up the mountain was silent and heavy. The public humiliation stung, but what scared Clara more was Eli's reaction. It wasn't just protective anger, it was fear. The woman Martha knew him. She knew his past. And his buying all that ammunition? He wasn't just stocking up. He was preparing for a siege. That night, after they'd put the supplies away, he finally spoke. I'm sorry for what happened in town, he said, not looking at her. It's not your fault, Clara said quietly. It is, he insisted, his voice raw. I brought this on you. I never should have. He trailed off, running a hand through his hair. Should have what? Left me with my father? She asked, a bit of an edge to her voice. He looked at her then, his eyes full of a pain that seemed ancient. Maybe. you would have been safer. I've never been safe, she said, the truth of it landing hard between them. At least here, at least here, I can learn to shoot. A flicker of something, surprise, respect, passed over his face. He gave a short, humorless laugh. Yeah, I guess you can at that. He stood up and walked to the door, looking out into the impenetrable darkness. Martha, she's connected to the people I told you about, the ones from my past. He finally turned to face her, his expression grim. They know I'm here, Clara, and they're coming. The first real rain of spring came with a restless wind, drumming on the roof all night. Clara woke with the taste of dread in her mouth. Eli was already gone, out checking the fence line near the lower pasture. She busied herself inside, kneading bread, stoking the fire, anything to keep the fear at bay. Around midday, a knock came at the door. It wasn't Eli's knock. It was sharp, hurried. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She grabbed the rifle from its place by the door before she even looked through the peephole. A man stood on the porch, soaked from the rain, his hat pulled low. But even with the years between them, she knew that face. It was her brother, Samuel. She lowered the rifle, her mind reeling. She hadn't seen Samuel since the day he'd stood by and watched their father sell her. He'd been a boy then. Now he was a man, with lines around his mouth and a haunted look in his eyes. She slowly unbarred the door. Clara, he said, his voice rough. Pa's gone. The words didn't land. Gone. She felt nothing. A strange, hollow emptiness. Samuel glanced past her into the cabin. You live in here? With him? She stepped aside, letting him in. He looked around at the clean floors, the stocked shelves, the warmth of the fire. Pa said you ran off, Samuel said, rubbing the back of his neck. Said you shamed the family. Clara's hands tightened into fists. Ran off? She echoed, her voice dangerously quiet. I was sold, Sam, for $40 and a mule, and you just stood there. His eyes dropped to the floor. I know, I tried to stop him. He wouldn't listen. He looked back up at her, his eyes pleading. I didn't come to fight, Clara. I came to warn you. He took a step closer. Pa, he didn't just sell you to any random man. He sold you to Eli Harper for a reason. He knew who Eli was. Clara stared at him, confused. What are you talking about? Eli Harper used to ride with the Newton gang, Samuel said, the words tumbling out of him. They were the most feared outlaws in the territory. Robbed trains, banks, left a trail of bodies from here to Kansas. Eli was their enforcer, the deadliest of them all. The room seemed to tilt. Eli, an outlaw? It didn't make sense. The quiet man who carved birds out of wood? The man who had shown her nothing but gentle respect? No, she whispered. You're lying. I'm not, Samuel insisted. Pa knew because he used to sell them horses, look the other way. That's how he got so deep in debt. He owed the Newtons. When they came to collect, he didn't have the money, so he gave them something else. He gave them you. The horror of it washed over her, cold and sickening. She wasn't sold to pay a debt. She was a payment, a piece of property handed over to a gang of killers. But Eli took you himself, Samuel continued, his voice urgent. He broke from the gang that very day, took you, and disappeared up here. The Newtons have been looking for him ever since. They think he stole their cut from the last train robbery, and they think he told you where it's hidden. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The watcher in the woods, Martha's taunts, the ammunition. Eli wasn't just hiding from his past. He was hiding from his partners, and they thought she was the key. They're close, Clara, Samuel said, grabbing her arm. I heard them talking in Mill Crossing. They know where he is. They're coming to get their money back, and they'll tear you apart to find out what you know. You have to leave. Now, come back with me. She looked at her brother's terrified face. Then she looked around the small cabin. This place she had started to think of as home. She thought of Eli out on the mountain, completely unaware that his past was about to come crashing down on them. Leave? Run away? The old Clara would have. But the woman who stood there now, the woman who knew how to load a rifle and face down a blizzard? She wasn't the same girl. No, she said, her voice steady. I'm not running. Samuel stared at her as if she were crazy. Clara, they will kill you. Let them try, she said. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But for the first time in her life, it was smaller than her anger. She had been sold, betrayed, and used as a pawn in a game she didn't even know she was playing. No more. This was her mountain now, and she would not give it up without a fight. After Samuel left, a grim resolve settled over Clara. She barred the door, loaded the rifle, and waited. The rain beat against the windows, mirroring the storm inside her. Eli, a killer, an outlaw. It seemed impossible, and yet it explained everything. The secret chest in the shed, the haunted look in his eyes, the constant vigilance. He hadn't bought her, he had stolen her. He had taken her from one monster only to deliver her into the hands of others. The anger was a hot fire in her chest. When Eli finally returned, soaked to the bone, he stopped dead in the doorway when he saw her. She was sitting at the table, the rifle laid across it, pointing right at his heart. Your brother was here, she said, her voice flat and cold. Eli's face paled. He slowly closed the door behind him. He didn't make a move toward her. Clara, let me explain. Explain what? She spat. That you were part of the Newton gang? That my father sold me to you to pay off a debt to a pack of murderers? That you've been lying to me every single day since I got here? His eyes closed briefly, a flicker of pain crossing his features. Yes, all of that is true. The simple, honest confession caught her off guard. She'd expected more lies, more denials. But it's not the whole truth, he said, taking a cautious step forward. Don't come any closer, she warned, her knuckles white on the rifle stock. He stopped. Your father was going to give you to Jedediah Newton, the leader of the gang. Jedediah. He's not like other men. What he does to people, especially women. He couldn't finish the sentence. I couldn't let that happen. I told them I'd take you as my share. I took the money they thought I stole. It was my money, my cut from years of riding with them, and I used it to pay your father off. I got you away from them. That's the truth, Clara. I swear it. She stared at him, searching his face for a lie. She saw regret. She saw fear. But she didn't see deception. Still, the betrayal stung. So you're a thief and a killer, she said, but you have a code of honor. Is that it? I'm not asking you to forgive me, he said, his voice ragged. God knows I don't deserve it. But I am asking you to believe me. Everything I've done since that day has been to keep you safe. Safe? She cried, a wild, bitter laugh escaping her lips. The whole gang is coming here to kill us. They think I know where your stolen money is. How is that safe? The money is gone, he said. I used most of it to set us up here, and the rest I got rid of it. There's nothing for them to find. Just then, a sound from outside cut through the tension, a low, desperate bleating. Clara glanced out the window. The creek, swollen with rain, was a raging torrent. Entangled in the debris near the bank was one of their neighbor's goats, its leg caught, the water pulling it under. Without a second thought, the rifle forgotten on the table, she ran outside. The rain was coming down in sheets, the wind tearing at her. The bank was slick mud, the water a churning, icy brown. Clara, no! Eli shouted, running after her. It's too dangerous! But she didn't listen. She kicked off her boots and waded into the freezing water, gripping a low-hanging branch for balance. The current was powerful, tugging at her, trying to pull her feet out from under her. The water was up to her waist, the cold so intense it burned. She reached the terrified animal, her fingers numb as she worked to untangle its leg from the branches. The goat struggled, its horns catching her in the shoulder, but she held on, speaking to it in a low, calming voice. Eli was on the bank, a rope in his hand, his face a mask of terror. Just let it go, Clara. It's not worth it. Everything is worth it, she screamed back over the roar of the water, and she wasn't just talking about the goat. She finally pulled the leg free and, with a surge of adrenaline, hauled the shivering animal back toward the bank. Eli grabbed her arm, pulling her and the goat onto the muddy ground. They lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, soaked and freezing. He looked at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and disbelief. He wasn't looking at the woman he had saved. He was looking at the woman who had just walked into a flood to save a life, without a moment's hesitation. The woman who hadn't run from a fight, but had instead met it head-on. In that moment, something shifted between them. The lies and secrets were still there, but so was a new raw respect. "You're the strongest person I've ever met," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Before she could answer, they heard a new sound. It wasn't the storm. It was the thunder of hoofbeats. Dozens of them, coming up the trail, fast. Eli's face went grim. He scrambled to his feet, pulling her up with him. "They're here!" They scrambled back to the cabin, slamming and barring the door just as the first riders burst into the clearing. There were at least a dozen of them, hard-faced men with rifles cradled in their arms. They fanned out, surrounding the small cabin. A man on a big black horse rode to the front. He was older, with a long gray beard and cold, dead eyes. "Eli Harper," he boomed, his voice carrying over the wind. "You've got something that belongs to me, and I've come to collect." It was Jedediah Newton. Eli grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, his face set like stone. Clara's heart was pounding, but her hands were steady as she picked up the second rifle and moved to the other window. They were trapped, outnumbered. "He thinks the money is in the cabin," Eli whispered. "He'll tear this place apart piece by piece until he finds it." "You told me you got rid of it," Clara said, her eyes scanning the men outside. "I did," Eli confirmed. "But he'll never believe me." "Then we'll have to make him," she said. Jedediah laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. "I know you're in there, Eli, and I know you've got that fat cow I paid for in there with you. Send her out. She can tell me where the money is, and maybe I'll let you live." Clara flinched at his words, but the fire in her belly burned hotter. "Fat cow, am I?" she muttered under her breath. A sudden, crazy idea sparked in her mind. "The chest," she said to Eli. "The one in the shed." Eli looked at her, confused. "What about it?" "What's in it?" she demanded. "My past," he said grimly. "Old letters, journals, a few keepsakes from a life I'm trying to forget." "Is it heavy?" she asked. He nodded. "Yes, very." "Good," Clara said, a plan forming. "Can you get to it?" Eli's eyes followed her gaze to the back of the cabin, where a small trapdoor led to a shallow root cellar that exited just behind the house, near the shed. It was a long shot. "They'll see me," he said. "Not if I create a distraction," she replied. Before he could stop her, she took a deep breath and shouted through the door, her voice ringing with a false panic. "Don't hurt him. I'll tell you where it is. The money is buried under the hearth." Jedediah's cold eyes lit up with greed. "See, Eli? The woman has some sense. Now send her out." "No!" Clara yelled back. "You'll kill me. I'll slide it out under the door. But you have to pull your men back first. Give me room." Outside, Jedediah considered this. His men murmured among themselves. It was a risk, but the thought of the money was too tempting. "All right, woman," he shouted. "Pull 'em back, boys. Back to the tree line." As the gang slowly backed their horses away, Clara turned to Eli, her eyes blazing. "The chest. Get the chest and bring it to the front porch. I have an idea." He stared at her, seeing the fierce intelligence in her eyes. He didn't question her. He just nodded, lifted the trap door, and disappeared into the darkness below. Clara held her breath, watching the men at the edge of the clearing. It felt like an eternity. Finally, she heard a faint scraping sound from the front porch. Eli was back, pressing himself flat against the cabin wall, the heavy chest beside him. "Now what?" he whispered through the wall. "Now we give them what they want," she said. She turned back to the door. "Okay, I'm pushing it out. It's in an old chest." She put her shoulder to the door and shoved it open just a crack. Then with all her strength, she kicked the heavy wooden table, sending it crashing into the stone hearth. A loud cracking sound echoed through the clearing. "The hearthstone is loose," she screamed. "It's stuck. I need help." It was the perfect bait. Jedediah's greed overrode his caution. "Useless woman," he snarled. "Three of you, go in there and get it. The rest of you, cover them." Three of the outlaws dismounted and cautiously approached the cabin, their guns raised. This was the moment. Clara backed away from the door, her rifle ready. As the first man stepped through the doorway, A shadow fell over him from above. Eli, who had climbed onto the low porch roof, dropped the heavy chest directly onto the outlaw's head. The man went down like a sack of bricks without a sound. The other two outlaws stared in shock for a split second, and that's all Clara needed. Her rifle barked, and the second man crumpled to the ground, clutching his leg. The third spun around to run, but Eli was already on him, tackling him to the mud-soaked ground. It was chaos. Jedediah and the rest of the gang opened fire, splinters flying from the cabin walls. Clara slammed the door shut, barring it just as bullets ripped through the wood. She ran to the window, firing back, her movements sure and steady. Outside, Eli used the third outlaw as a shield, dragging him toward the cover of the woodpile. It was a desperate, impossible fight. 2 people against a dozen hardened killers. But they had something the outlaws didn't. They were fighting for their home. They were fighting for each other. And Clara was no longer the girl who had been sold. She was a force of nature. The mountain had taught her how to be strong, and the man beside her had taught her what it felt like to have something worth fighting for. The siege had begun. The gunfight raged for what felt like an eternity. Bullets chewed through the log walls of the cabin. Glass from the single window shattered, spraying across the floor. Clara and Eli worked together in a seamless, deadly rhythm. He'd call out a target, and she'd fire. She'd point out a man trying to flank them, and he'd drive him back. They were hopelessly outgunned, but they were smarter. They knew the land. Eli used the woodpile for cover, his shots precise and sparing. Clara used the cabin's thick walls, moving from the window to the door, making it seem like there were more than 2 people inside. But the outlaws were relentless. Jedediah Newton, furious at being tricked, pushed his men forward. They used the trees and rocks for cover, inching closer. One of them managed to get close enough to toss a flaming torch onto the roof of the shed. The dry timber caught instantly, flames licking up into the rainy sky. "They're trying to burn us out," Eli yelled. The smoke was already starting to drift toward the cabin. Panic tried to claw its way up Clara's throat, but she shoved it down. "The root cellar," she said, her mind racing. "It exits behind the house. They won't be watching it." Eli looked at her, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You want to circle around behind them." "They think we're trapped in here," she said. "They won't expect it." It was a crazy risk, but staying in the cabin was a death sentence. "All right," Eli said, giving her a look of pure, unadulterated trust. "On my signal." He started firing rapidly from the front window, drawing all the attention. "Go!" he yelled. Clara lifted the trap door and slipped into the cool, damp darkness of the cellar. She crawled through the narrow tunnel, the smell of earth filling her senses. It was tight, and her shoulders scraped against the sides, but she pushed forward. She could hear the muffled gunshots and shouting above her. She emerged behind the cabin, shielded by a thicket of aspen trees. The shed was now fully engulfed in flames, casting a hellish orange glow on the scene. The outlaws were all focused on the front of the cabin, their backs to her. She crept forward, silent as a shadow, her rifle held tight. She had a clear shot at 3 of them. She took a deep breath, aimed, and fired. 1, 2, 3. 3 shots, so fast they sounded like one. 3 men dropped before they even knew what hit them. The rest of the gang spun around in confusion, realizing they were being attacked from the rear. Their panic gave Eli the opening he needed. He burst out of the cabin, firing as he ran, diving behind the stone well for cover. Now the outlaws were caught in a crossfire. Clara hidden in the trees, and Eli protected by the well. The odds had suddenly dramatically shifted. Jedediah Newton roared in frustration, firing wildly into the trees where Clara was hidden. Bark exploded next to her head, but she held her ground, firing back with calm precision. One by one, the outlaws fell. The clearing became a scene of carnage. Finally, only 2 were left standing, Jedediah and one of his men. The man looked at Jedediah, then at the bodies of his comrades, and decided he'd had enough. He threw down his rifle and ran for his horse, disappearing into the darkness. Now it was just Jedediah. He was crouched behind a large boulder, cornered. "It's over, Jedediah," Eli yelled. "Give it up." Jedediah's response was a crazed laugh. "It's never over, Eli. You took what was mine, not just the money. You took my honor." He fired his last shot toward Eli, then broke from cover, running not for his horse but straight for the burning shed. "If I can't have it, no one can," he screamed. Eli and Clara both realized what he was doing at the same time. The shed wasn't just for tools. Eli had stored the last of his black powder in there to keep it dry. "Get down!" Eli screamed, tackling Clara and pulling her behind the stone well, just as the shed exploded in a massive fireball. The force of the blast threw them against the well, the sound a deafening roar that shook the very ground beneath them. Wood and fire rained down all around them. The battle was over. As the echoes of the explosion faded, a deafening silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the crackle of the dying flames and the soft patter of the rain. Clara and Eli slowly got to their feet, bruised and battered, their ears ringing. They looked at the devastation around them. The bodies of the outlaws lay scattered across the clearing. The shed was gone, a crater of blackened earth in its place. The cabin was riddled with bullet holes, but it was still standing. They had survived. They stood there for a long moment, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving them exhausted and trembling. Eli turned to Clara, his face smudged with soot, his eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't quite read. "You," he started, his voice hoarse, "you were incredible." Clara just shook her head, unable to speak. She looked down at her hands, still clutching the rifle. They were steady. She had faced down a dozen killers, fought in a gun battle, and survived an explosion. And she hadn't flinched. The woman who had been afraid of her own shadow just a year ago was gone. In her place was someone else, someone forged in the fire of this mountain. Eli took a step closer and gently took the rifle from her hands, setting it aside. Then he did something he had never done before. He pulled her into his arms. It wasn't a gentle, comforting hug. It was a desperate, grateful embrace, as if he was trying to assure himself she was real, that she was still there. Clara stiffened for a moment, the unfamiliarity of it a shock to her system. But then, slowly, she relaxed into his hold, resting her head against his chest, smelling the wood smoke and sweat and gunpowder on his shirt. She felt his heart beating, strong and steady against her cheek. For the first time in her life, she felt completely and utterly safe. Not because the danger was gone, but because she had faced it and won. And she hadn't done it alone. "It's over," he whispered into her hair. "It's finally over." But as she stood there, wrapped in his arms, looking at the carnage, she knew he was wrong. Jedediah was gone, but the world knew Eli Harper was alive. His past wasn't buried anymore. It had been blown wide open. This wasn't the end of their fight. It was just the beginning. The first frost came early that year, dusting the meadow in white. The holes in the cabin walls had been patched, the shattered window replaced. But the scars on the land and on them remained. In the quiet days that followed the gunfight, a new kind of silence settled between them. It wasn't the wary, uncertain silence of before. It was deeper, filled with unspoken things. They had been through a war together, and it had bonded them in a way words never could. One morning, Clara rose before dawn to light the stove. Eli was already at the table, mending a saddle strap, his movements slow and deliberate. "Cold morning," she said, handing him a mug of coffee. He took it, but his eyes stayed on her, steady and serious. It was a look that made her heart beat a little faster. "Clara," he began, his voice low, "I've been thinking." She tried to lighten the mood. "That sounds dangerous." But he didn't smile. "When I brought you here, I told myself it was to save you from Newton. And that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth." He put down the strap and looked at his calloused hands. "I was lonely. This mountain was empty. I thought I deserved to be alone after the life I'd lived. But then you came, and you were so quiet, so broken. I thought I was the one giving you shelter, doing the saving." He finally looked up, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. "I was wrong. You've been saving me every single day since you arrived. You fought for this place. You fought for me. You showed me that a home isn't just four walls. It's the person you fight for." Tears burned at the back of Clara's eyes. All her life she'd been told she was a burden. Too much, not enough, too big, too loud. too broken. But this man, this killer and outlaw with a gentle heart, he looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. He stood up and crossed the small space between them. He didn't touch her. Not yet. I know what they said about you. I know what you think of yourself. But they were all wrong. You're not too much of anything. You are exactly what I needed. He finally reached out and took her hands in his. They were warm and strong. I'm not asking for promises, Clara. I'm just asking you to stay. Not because you have nowhere else to go, but because you want to. Because this is your home now, if you'll have it. The cabin was silent save for the crackle of the fire. She looked at the man in front of her, scarred and imperfect. A man who had seen the worst of the world and the worst of himself. And she saw a reflection of her own broken pieces. But together, they made something whole. I'll stay, she whispered, the words feeling more true than anything she had ever said. He smiled, a slow, genuine smile that transformed his rugged face, and then he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a fiery, passionate kiss. It was gentle and tentative and full of all the things they hadn't been able to say. It tasted of coffee and wood smoke and second chances. It tasted like coming home. By the next spring, the meadow was alive again. Purple lupine and yellow balsam root carpeted the hills. But the biggest change wasn't the seasons. It was the sound of laughter. Word of the gunfight had spread through the valley. They didn't whisper about the fat girl Eli Harper bought anymore. They whispered about the woman who had faced down the Newton gang. The children from the valley started to come up the mountain, drawn by the legend. Clara, to her own surprise, started teaching them. How to plant a garden, how to read, how to be brave. Eli built benches under the aspen trees so she could hold her lessons in the shade. They never spoke of vows or rings. They didn't need to. What they had was chosen every single day in the quiet moments. A cup of coffee left by the bedside. A coat draped over her shoulders when the wind turned. A shared look across a crowded yard full of laughing children. They had faced the ghosts of the past and won. They had built a life not on a foundation of safety, but on a bedrock of shared strength. In the stillness of the Bitterbrush Hills, Clara finally understood. Love doesn't have to be loud to be real. Sometimes it's in the way someone waits for you at the gate. Sometimes it's the steady presence of someone who has seen your darkest corners and chooses to stay. Eli Harper never promised her the world. He just shared his. And for Clara, who had once been told she was too much to be wanted, the gentle truth was this. She wasn't too much. She was exactly enough. And for Eli, who had lived so long in the shadows, she was the light. Out there, where the winters are long and the wind can be unkind, they built something rarer than gold, a life rooted in trust, forgiveness, and the steady, quiet choice to face whatever came next, side by side. And maybe that's a lesson for all of us. Second chances don't always come wrapped in perfection. Sometimes they come in the shape of a person who sees you, really sees you, and stays. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It really helps the channel grow. Share this story with someone who might need a little bit of hope today, and let us know in the comments. What do you think was the bravest thing Clara did? We love hearing from you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.